So Dr. Doug Landry is going to be your first speaker, and as you can see, he's going to talk about the well-dressed astronaut. And what qualifies him to do that, one, he's a PhD. Two, he is our historian, our museum historian. He's also a curator, which is a pretty special job, and he was the curator for the Space Gallery, which is in the 4th building, as you've probably already seen. So he knows what he's talking about. In fact, he did his dissertation, his doctoral dissertation on spacesuits. So without further ado, I'll let Dr. Landry talk about spacesuits. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. This is a pretty special day. As Mike mentioned, we have family days all the time, but this particular one, if you like space, this is your day. Now, Mike's little sheet says, say something about self. Okay, so how many of you remember where you were 20 years ago, or 50 years ago today? Were you watching this thing? Were you aware of it, right? Okay, so it gave you the enthusiasm to come back 50 years later. I was 5 years old when all this happened, and I watched it on the TV in my folks' living room. And on the 25th anniversary, I was a young intern in the conservation department at the Smithsonian and had the privilege of working on spacesuits and inside the Apollo 11 spacecraft, because it was tilted at a weird angle and I was young enough to get in there and monkey around and like survive the experience and get in and out of the thing. So that's when the topic of spacesuits became a special thing to me. I wanted to figure out how they work. Where do these things come from? How are they made? And so I started studying them, and here we are today, another 25 years, and now here we are talking about spacesuits. So my talk today is going to be a breezy, fast, fun, non-technical introduction to spacesuits. And don't be shy to stop me right in the middle and say, what do you mean by that? Or what about this thing? Because we want to just have a conversation about this. So lots of fun pictures, a movie or two. We'll get started. Okay, so first of all, what's a spacesuit? What is a spacesuit? People have been imagining suits for space for a long time. They appear in fiction as well as fact. And the main thing about spacesuits is that they are garments meant to allow you to move and work and survive in the most inhospitable of environments for humans. Space is not friendly to the human body, and we'll explore that. Where did spacesuits come from? Well, people have been trying to protect the human body for a long, long, long time. When people started flying at a little bit of altitude in balloons in the middle of the 18th century, they found out pretty fast that the higher you went, the more difficult it was to breathe, and people passed out and got sick, and some of them died and so on. And so it was clear there's a problem. What is the problem with the atmosphere? Well, people diving on shipwrecks found out something like the same thing. When the pressure changes around your human body, breathing gets dicey. There's something about air and something about pressure that makes it hard when you go either way up or way down and the pressure changes. The picture you see on the bottom right there it's people working in a bridge caisson, putting footings under bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge and so on. When they worked under rivers in big boxes full of pressurized oxygen, workers came up from those projects and got caisson disease, what we know as the bends. And this is all about changing atmospheric pressure. So what about this pressure? Well, and we'll talk about Wiley Post here in a minute. It turns out that here at just about sea level, we're very comfortable in our atmosphere that is about 20% oxygen and about 80% nitrogen and a few other things. And we live under a huge column of air that puts about 14.7 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure on our bodies. That's what we evolved to. That's what we were born and grew up with. So we don't even feel the weight of the atmosphere on us. But imagine a square inch of space on the top of your head. From the top of your head in that square inch of space all the way to about 75 miles up, that column of air weighs about 14.7 pounds. And it's all around us, and 20% of that is oxygen. The rest is nitrogen. But since we grew up with that, since we evolved to that, that's where our body works best. That's where we breathe best. If you change the equation, you lower the pressure, you change the mix, strange things begin to happen in the body. And since we're talking about space today, it's very closely related to aviation. When you go up in the air, the mix of gases doesn't change. It's still 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, but the density changes. The pressure begins to go down. So when you go way, way up in the air in a balloon or climb a mountain, it's not that there's less oxygen in the atmosphere, it's that the atmosphere itself is thinner. And that's why it is more difficult to breathe. Think about that mix of, that 80-20 mix, right? Out of all that pressure, 14.7 pounds, about 3 pounds of it is what oxygen is made up of. So you need just over 3 pounds per square inch of oxygen in order to get oxygen into your blood through your lungs. Why is that figure important? It's what makes spacesuits work. See this guy wearing a suit here? That's Wiley Post in the 1930s. And as he was flying higher and higher, he and his fellow engineers, and a lot of other people, it wasn't just Wiley Post, figured out that if they filled a suit with just oxygen, they didn't have to inflate it very much. If it was just oxygen and no nitrogen, they only had to inflate it to just over 3 pounds per square inch and not 14.7. You could still breathe, but you'd just be breathing oxygen. That works great, but there are problems. We'll get to that in a minute. So aviators were trying this, and then the military tried it. Wartime has brought on a lot of development in things like pressure suits, leading eventually to spacesuits. And here's one of the most important ones. This is what incorporates what are called tomato worm joints. See the elbows and the legs there? If you inflate a suit like that to 14.7 pounds and then remove all the atmosphere outside of it, it's impossible to move in. It's like a really, really stiff balloon, like a tire. So the difference between 0 pounds pressure on the outside and 14.7 inside makes it impossible to move. But what if it's only 3 pounds on the inside and 0 on the outside? It's not quite as inflated, and it's much easier to move. That's why spacesuits use 100% oxygen. You don't have to inflate them as much, and it makes them able to move. And here's just an illustration of that whole thing. Here's the blue part is all that nitrogen in the atmosphere. The green part is that little bit of oxygen, and it's all at 14.7. And your happy balloon there is a happy human at sea level saying, "This is great. I love this. I can live just fine." Change that to space where there's 0 pounds of pressure in the atmosphere, or there is no atmosphere really. Well, your spacesuit can't move. It's so stiff that it couldn't move if it was at 14.7 pounds. So remove all the nitrogen, use oxygen only, and you only have to inflate it to about a little over 3 pounds. And now you can move. and still breathe. So your little balloon there on the lower right is still a happy human, but it's wearing a spacesuit to keep it alive. So what else does a spacesuit do aside from giving you the atmospheric pressure and the oxygen that you need to live? It does other things too. It protects people from what are called micrometeoroids. Micrometeoroids are little bits of space, rock, and dust and whatnot that can travel as fast as about 155,000 miles per hour. So a lot of physics math there. If a grain of sand is flying at you at 155,000 miles an hour, it has about the same force as a small bullet. And so if you don't have something protecting you from that, it's going to put a hole in you and your spacecraft. Spacesuits have been engineered to provide many layers of protection against micrometeoroids, these little tiny bits of dust that can hit going really fast. They've been tested and approved, and through experience, we know that even when a spacesuit is hit by one of these little tiny things, it won't go all the way through it and put a hole in it because of many, many layers of insulation that slow it down and stop it. Spacesuits also provide some radiation protection. Not very much, though. All the different kinds of radiation that astronauts face in space are unfiltered. We depend on our atmosphere to protect us from a lot of radiation. But without an atmosphere, all of it is coming at you. And so a spacesuit protects from some of it, but note that when the sun is really acting up and making solar flares, that delays working outside of things like space stations because there's too much radiation. So it gives you some protection, but it not complete. Temperature control is important. A spacesuit contains a mechanism for keeping your body at a comfy temperature. Note that space by itself doesn't have a temperature because there's no atmosphere. But objects in space, things that are out there floating in space, they acquire a temperature because of all that radiation. So when you're out there in orbit around your space station, you can acquire about plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, or in the dark about minus 250 or thereabouts. So you can get really hot and really cold because there's either no energy hitting you or there's a whole bunch of energy hitting you. So spacesuits help to regulate your body heat, keeping it in and shedding it as necessary to keep you at a comfortable temperature. And we'll discuss later how that's done. So the stuff you can see here in the museum, you can go to the Space Gallery and walk through Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and Space Shuttle, and you can see how these things have changed from then to now. So spacesuits in Project Mercury. Well, it's the classic silver spacesuit, right? Why silver? Why aluminized nylon on the outside of the spacesuit? Flying suits weren't silver. Well, some were in the X-15, but why? Why? It's because the aluminized part of the outside of the suit reflects heat. Just like a mirror reflects light, light is energy, a silver suit reflects heat energy. Some other things about the Mercury suit that were kind of remarkable were that each one was fitted for an individual astronaut. What they would do is they'd put an astronaut in long underwear, and then they'd get them soaking wet. And then they'd have these long strips of brown paper, like from a paper bag, and they'd put these strips of paper on the astronaut while in a sitting position. Then when it was all dry, they would cut it off the astronaut and reassemble it to have an exact model of the astronaut's body, and they could make a suit to fit. The Mercury suits were really, really tight-fitting. They had 13 different zippers on them. Took a long time to get into and out of. And they were evolved from a Navy flying suit made by B.F. Goodrich. They were not the most comfortable suits in the world or the most flexible. Then again, how much room is there to move inside the Mercury spacecraft? None. Zero. Really small spacecraft. So not being able to move much was not a big problem. You could kind of flex your elbows and your wrists and move your hands, move your head just a little bit. But these suits weren't made for doing anything but sitting in one spot and proving that you could survive in a spaceship for a couple of hours or a couple of days. So that's how Mercury suits worked. Again, a Navy suit, not too complex in today's terms, but then it was the very latest thing. The helmets, by the way, in these Mercury suits represented a little more than half the cost of the whole suit, because the liner had to be made from a cast of your head. It was so perfectly fitting that they were made for individuals, and you couldn't move your head inside the helmet. The helmet had to move with you. And that faceplate on the front that pivots up and down, that was fine for Mercury, but we'll see later it wasn't fine for very long. It's a chance for oxygen to leak out of the suit, and you want to eliminate those chances, right? You want to make it as solid as possible. And by the way, was the Mercury suit really a space suit? Well, it was a suit worn on space missions in a spacecraft. But if you think a spacesuit is for moving and working in space, that's not what this one did. This was a backup in case the spacecraft got a hole in it and lost its atmosphere. This was just for safety's sake. And so, even though that's a spacesuit, yes, with big quotes around it, I wouldn't specifically define that Mercury suit as a space suit. But moving forward, past 1963, here comes Project Gemini. Really ambitious, building on what we learned in Mercury. Now the spacesuits have to do better and different things for longer periods under different conditions. Project Gemini is where we leave the spacecraft and actually move and work outside the spaceship. And for my money, this is the beginning of real spacesuits for working in space. The Gemini suit had some really important differences from the Mercury suit. In the Mercury suit, you couldn't move very much because you were just sort of sewn in place in a tight-fitting thing. In the Gemini suit, they had this really clever idea, which came from the Air Force. What they did was they had this bladder inside that would contain all the oxygen, all that atmosphere that you need, but around that bladder, they put a layer of what's called link net. Link net think of it as like a fishing net that covers your whole body, and it's just all linked together. It's got holes in it. But it encloses the whole thing, and it keeps it from blowing up too big. That is the thing that restrained that bladder from really inflating like a giant balloon and allowed the astronauts to move their elbows and wrists and hips and knees and so on. It worked actually fairly well. But then again, Gemini astronauts were not walking on any other planet, and they weren't installing big, heavy experiments and using hammers and drills and whatnot. They were essentially floating outside of the spacecraft and trying out this new skill called spacewalking. So here you have Ed White spacewalking. He was an Air Force officer. He's wearing a Gemini G4C with lots of cover layers. And the cover layers in these suits, the outside was, have you ever heard of Nomex? Nomex nylon. Nomex is a synthetic material that can withstand up to about 700 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. After that, hotter than that, and it begins to melt. But Nomex is pretty good material for this. Notice that the suit is not silver. It turned out that the silver aluminized nylon, the silver parts would flake off after a while because they're really easy. They didn't withstand much abrasion and so on. And it turned out they weren't really all that necessary. The white color of a suit would reflect energy just as well. So no longer a need for silver because it was kind of a problem. So white became the best color to reflect that energy. And a lot of this material just turns out to be white anyway. So good thing for that. So 2 people in a Gemini spacecraft, one of them going out to practice spacewalking. The other one stayed in the spacecraft, but the door was still open. So I think that suit still counts as a space suit because the space environment is right in there with you. One other suit that was used in Gemini was something they informally called the Get Me Down suit. It's the one in the middle there. It looks like a giant bug. That was kind of an emergency only suit. And it didn't have many cover layers, and it was big and loose and very flexible and so on. Was only to be used in case of emergency. It was for missions where no one was going outside the spacecraft at all. And so the reason they called it a Get Me Down suit is because if they had to return right away and there's a problem with the spacecraft, they'd have this suit to get me down right now, and it would protect them on the way down. Funny looking suit though, isn't it? Strange looking. The one on the right is a regular Gemini G4C. Okay, so we get to the topic that we're talking about this weekend, Project Apollo. Okay, now we have to have a spacesuit that does all the stuff. It has to regulate your temperature. It has to provide enough atmospheric pressure and the right kind of atmosphere to allow you to work and live and move. And it also has to protect against micrometeoroids. And this time, it needs to allow you to walk around on a ground that isn't Earth at 1/6 gravity and use tools and carry things and pick them up, bend and stoop, walk all over the place. There are a lot of demands on this suit. So if you take a close look at pictures like this, you can tell who's walking on the moon and who isn't. Which one of those guys is not going to walk on the moon? Can you tell just from the picture? From the suit by itself? The middle guy. Why?
Less quartz.
Yes, bingo. And he's, yeah, perfect. I need to remember that. Can I use that? Plus he's not smiling.
Neil's got the biggest smile.
Yeah, okay. Big smile, kind of a grin. Yeah, here I am. I'm driving. Okay, I'm going to use that. I'm absolutely going to adopt that. But if you couldn't see their grins at all, you would see their suits. You see astronaut Collins with only inlet and outlet on one side. These guys, blue is in and red is out, by the way. These guys have 2 sets of everything. Why? Because when they're walking on the moon, if there was an emergency, and when they transition from the spacecraft to the backpack to another spacecraft or to, in an emergency, to the other astronaut, you have to be connected to 2 things at once in order to make these transfers. So you have to have 2 sets of oxygen in, oxygen out. Water in, water out. The water, by the way, might as well use this thing. That's where the water goes in and out. Oxygen in, oxygen out, and biomedicals. Where's the? Right there. So all these connectors, the electrical connector lets people on the ground listen to your heartbeat and track your blood pressure, and also it makes the radio work and so on. It lets the doctors monitor you and lets you communicate. The multiple water connector is important because the backpack on the back of the suit circulates cold water through a network of tubes on this close-fitting suit that you wear under the spacesuit. It's called a liquid cooling garment. This is important because it's not air conditioning. These suits weren't air conditioned. Air conditioning actually turned out to be kind of not efficient for spacesuits. Removing your body heat through sweat evaporating is fine if you're not wearing something bulky, but removing your body heat through cold water conduction is much more efficient. Like when you go outside today, take a cold can of soda and put it on your forehead. That's cooling by conduction, and it's way more efficient than just putting cool air on you and waving it past you. It removes body heat just like that. So these Apollo astronauts removed body heat with this crazy tight-fitting suit full of little tubes full of circulating cool water that they could adjust the temperature to. Some people liked it kind of warm in there, other people liked it really cold. You could adjust it, and their backpack carried all the pumps and everything that made that work. So what's under the white covers? The Apollo suits were really, really highly engineered pieces of equipment. I mean, it took years to figure out how to make a suit that will let people move and work and even drive little cars on the moon. So the one on the left is an earlier model or an intravehicular suit, and you'll see this that white thing on the front of it. It's a strap that's kind of like a seatbelt, but it's a block and tackle. It helps the astronaut maintain a sitting position without having to do a sit-up. Remember, the suit is inflated, right? It wants to stay like this. And so sitting down would be a constant effort. You'd always be doing a crunch unless you have a block and tackle where you can sit down and then you cinch it, lock it, and now you're bent into that shape and you won't move. You don't have to do a sit-up the whole time. Now your block and tackle is helping you to do it. The suit on the right is kind of the ultimate moonwalking suit. It has a zipper that lets you do everything. See how the waist part of it is really highly segmented? They didn't want to make astronauts do crunches and use a block and tackle just to get on the rover and go driving around. They wanted people just to be able to bend over and even kneel down and pick up stuff off the ground really easily. So they had to take the zipper that used to go from the back of your neck all the way down your back, under your crotch, and up to about the middle of your belly. They took that zipper and instead they put it on your shoulder, ran it under your arm and around your waist. That way you could get into the suit without having a zipper going through the waist. Now the waist can be really, really flexible. And that's why if you look at pictures from different Apollo missions, you'll see, well, those connectors change places. They appear to be in all these different spots on these later missions. Well, that's why. The suits were reconfigured for better mobility, and that meant all the connections and all the hardware had to move around. But you know what? The most important part of these whole suits were the joints at the knees, this joint, that joint, the wrists, and the neck. The companies that made these suits and the company that made this suit kept a very tight lid on how they made these so-called joint convolutes. They were the secret to making a suit that wouldn't blow up like a balloon, but would let you move really, really easily. They were a mix of rubber and neoprene in a very special mold shape with steel cables running through it on two sides. They were very hard to make. A lot of them failed, and it took a kind of magic to dip these things by hand in a mold and turn them around while they were drying and so on. Kind of like when you see people making cotton candy at the fair, it's kind of what it's like. You dip the mold and you turn it around and you make it just so. A lot of them didn't work, but it took real skill to make ones that turned out well. And so the joint convolute allowed these astronauts to do the work that they had to do on the moon. Here's an astronaut trying out the driver's seat. That's one of those late model suits with no zipper running up and down the back. Instead, the zipper's right there, running this way. So it's not preventing him from bending at the waist. So he can get on and off of that rover very easily. Now, having said that, the suits still were bulky, right? They weighed a lot, but in 1/6 gravity, you could still hop around pretty easily. People were pretty mobile. By the way, take a look at YouTube films of these guys walking around on the moon. You'll see that they do not put one foot in front of the other very much. They do a kind of kangaroo hop or a bunny hop. The reason they did that, two reasons. Number one, it was easier to balance that way. Number two, the suits had cables running through the crotch that made putting one foot in front of the other pretty easy on Earth, but kind of hard on the moon. And so it was more comfortable just to go ba-doink, 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 like bunny hopping, rather than putting one foot in front of the other like we're used to. So skipping was fine on the moon and more comfortable, made moving easier. By the way, how about those 70s fashions? If you look up a guy named Homer Ream, who did an interview recently somewhere in the news about how he managed the suit program and was in mission control, hoping that the suits wouldn't spring a leak while those guys were on the moon 50 years ago today. You can see his interview now. There he is then. Same guy, but smoking a pipe and having an awesome 70s shirt. The suits took a beating on the moon. They got filthy. I mean, they were filthy. Anybody have a handheld cordless vacuum at home? Say thank you to the Apollo program for that, because they had one in the spacecraft. They had to vacuum the suits off because dust would get in everything. It went everywhere. And the dust on the moon was so fine and so gritty that it fouled up the connectors for helmets and the connectors for gloves. And it would have become very dangerous had any of those just seized up and refused to work. They were close to that because the dust was just impossible to deal with. Spill some Tang on top of that, now you've got a really sticky mess. And there were Tang spills too. Anybody drink Tang? Try that? Yeah, okay, so let some Tang dry on the counter, let some liquid Tang dry on the counter and see how sticky it is. Try that in a spacecraft with really fine moon dust and then put it in a finely machined ring and try to move it. You will see that things began to seize up. But the suits took a beating and none of them ever failed. No one was ever in any kind of danger from a spacesuit failing on the moon, but they sure did get filthy, and they brought a lot of dust and filth back with them on those suits. Here's the film I promised. Why would you play football in a spacesuit? What is the purpose of this? Well, the purpose of this was for the spacesuit maker to convince NASA that this is the suit you want to buy. This suit is so flexible and so rugged that you can play football in it. So they took the suit to a Dover, Delaware high school football field and they made this film. And they showed it to NASA, and you can run, jump, you can throw the football, you can kick the football. And what's more American than playing football in a spacesuit? I think that's pretty much tops them all. Now, this movie's running a little bit slow, and it'll end in just a second, but this is one of those little artifacts of the Apollo program that's just sort of fun to look at, is spacesuit engineers playing football. I wish I had some music to go with this, like the NFL theme or something. So, the question everybody wants to know about. How did they take care of personal needs in space and in a spacesuit? Well, inside the spacesuit, it was actually fairly easy. First of all, you want to avoid doing any of that if you can while you're wearing the suit. And so there's a diaper-like thing that you can wear, and also there was a urine collection device that went around the crew member's waist and then physically attached to them. So if they needed to, they could perform all these functions. They could go to the bathroom in the suit on the moon if they had to. In the spacecraft, when they weren't wearing the suits, they had that thing that you see on the left. Now, everybody does this. It's a human need. If you're going to be out in space for 8 or 10 days, this is going to happen. You're going to need this. And so the solution was what they called the top hat. It looks like a little top hat upside down. It has adhesive on it. And the only way that NASA could tastefully explain this was to have somebody in their super groovy 70s slacks show you exactly how that thing was supposed to work. So it is kind of self-explanatory. But there's no gravity and no privacy when all this is taking place. So the glamour of being an astronaut is, that part wasn't quite so glamorous. But they put up with it, and it worked. So moving on to the space shuttle after the Apollo program. What do we do next? Well, let's go into Earth orbit and launch satellites and work on them. What kind of suit are we going to need for that? Well, we don't need to walk on the moon anymore, but we want to use some better materials, and we don't want to make every single suit only for one person. We want to make a suit that can fit everybody, so let's make it in interchangeable parts with different sizes that you can mix and match and put them together and fit anybody. So, the Space Shuttle Extravehicular Mobility Unit. It came in 2 basic configurations. There's what they called the baseline, and then a couple of years later, the enhanced. But essentially, it's a suit where you don't have to walk on anything. You're just floating in space, but it's made of slightly different materials than those older Apollo suits, and they can be made to fit everyone. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago when there was a controversy that the first all-woman American spacewalk was canceled because they didn't have the right spacesuits? It's because they didn't have the middle part, the torso, the upper torso part. They didn't have one of those in the right size. The astronauts had previously worked with a bigger size, and they thought it was okay, but it was going to be safer to do it in a slightly smaller size, but they didn't have all those parts on hand. So it canceled that spacewalk. It's going to happen at some point. I'm confident it will, but it just depends on having all the right parts up there at the right time for the right people. Now the Space Shuttle EMU has been used continuously in one form or another since 1983. So while it's the top of the line, it's not brand new. It's been used for many, many years, and they've had lots of time to refine it and so on. It's still being used on the International Space Station. And one thing to know about the International Space Station, when you see pictures of it, when you see astronauts outside in a bright white spacesuit, that's an American one that you put on like the woman is putting it on the right. You put on the pants first, and it attaches to the top part, and then you put your gloves on, then you put your helmet on. But the International Space Station also has Russian spacesuits that are not very much like ours. But I'll get back to that in a second because my slides are out of order. So, orange suits. You see space shuttle astronauts going to and from the space shuttle wearing these orange suits. Those are launch and entry suits, not really space suits. They're more like very high altitude flying suits. Some people call them pumpkin suits because they're orange. Why do you think they're orange? Visibility, bingo, exactly right. If you end up in the water or on land or in the jungle someplace, if you end up outside the spacecraft, you want to be as visible as possible, because if you're wearing one of those and you're not in the space shuttle, something bad has happened and you want to be rescued right away. So that's why they're orange. What they really are is the very newest ones are still full pressure suits. They provide pressure for your whole body, but they also protect against high G forces or acceleration and deceleration forces, and they will allow people to escape the space shuttle at certain altitudes if they have to. But while they're in space, while they're on orbit, it's polo shirts and jumpsuits and comfortable clothes, and then the EMU, or the extravehicular mobility unit, while they're outside the space shuttle. So remember I mentioned there's Russian and American stuff? Russian suit on the left, American suit on the right. Notice that the Russian suit isn't quite bright white. That's because the outer covering is a little bit different material. It's made out of the Russian equivalent of Nomex. It's nylon. The American suits are covered in what's called ortho fabric, which is made by the W.L. Gore company, and it's a combination of all kinds of things. Anybody have a super rain repellent Gore-Tex raincoat at home? It's something like that, but thicker, and it contains a couple of different things, but it's essentially the same stuff. The Russian suit,
Who is the best one, and why did they not adopt whatever the best one is on both sides?
Oh, that's a good question. Who has the best one? Best probably depends on which one you trained with. It's probably a personal opinion kind of thing, but there are some important differences. The American suit can be recycled over and over and over, should last about 8 years or so. The Russian suit, after a certain number of EVAs, is destroyed. And so it is not, it's not especially modular, and it is not built to last nearly as long as the American suit. That said, it's got what I think is kind of a strange method of entry. You open a door in the back and you get into it, like you can see there on the left. You put your legs in, then you put your arms and your head in, or that's actually not right. You put your legs in, and then you turn around and close the door and seal it, and then you put your arms and your head in. So the advantage of the Russian one is you can get in and out yourself. The American suit requires help. You need help to get into that, because you need to put the pants on and then attach them to your waist. Then now you're kind of stuck here, and somebody puts your gloves on, and then someone else puts your helmet on and checks it. The Russian suit doesn't have a detachable helmet. All you have to do is shut the door yourself. So you're going to climb in there, twist around, shut the door, and then, yes?
A couple other things. Russian suit operated at 8 psi and ours was at 5 psi, if I remember correctly. And then the pre-breathe time operationally was different for them versus us.
Yes.
Longer, those were shorter, but they didn't have the dexterity at the higher pressure.
Exactly right. There's some other sort of design technical differences in the suit that have consequences about the time you need to spend getting nitrogen out of your blood and out of the fat tissues of your body before you go and do EVA work outside the spacecraft. And also, if the suit is operating at a higher internal pressure, that means it's stiffer and your fingers might not be as flexible and dexterous. And gripping things, I'll tell you what, these astronauts that do EVA, they have strong hands and strong arms, because gripping something requires constant pressure, because your glove wants to do this, but your hand wants to do that. So it's like that crunch thing where always doing a sit-up, always flexing to grab something. Those are very good points. I'm glad you brought that up. So there are differences, but whichever one you trained with is probably the one you like, I would think. Yes?
Not only did this guy work on those spacesuits with exactly what he's talking about, he was in a bar in France with Buzz Aldrin hanging out.
How about that? So you know firsthand do you know Bill Airy, by the way? No. Okay. Okay. So that all of that is exactly right. There's design differences and engineering differences that make these suits operate a little bit differently. And they look different, they work a little bit different, but just the same, they're both used and both allow people to work outside of spacecraft and protect them the way they're supposed to. And so they're both spacesuits, just coming from two different design traditions. You remember the pumpkin suits going in and out of the space shuttle? Americans get to the International Space Station using Russian launch and entry suits now. This suit is called a Sokol, or a Falcon suit. And look at the flag patches on their arms. Cosmonaut, cosmonaut, American astronaut. All three of them wearing Russian launch and entry suits. Those suits have been around a long time, and they work just perfectly well. But they're configured to match Russian spacecraft and Russian equipment, and so all of the space travelers, be they cosmonauts, astronauts, taikonauts, whoever they were, they wear those suits when they're traveling on Russian spacecraft up to the ISS, or International Space Station. So what's next? What's next? Maybe the moon again? Maybe Mars? Well, there are lots of different firms in the running to provide NASA with just the right suit. And NASA works on these things independently as well to make sure that the engineering is up to snuff and that all the best ideas are explored and tried. So the company that made the suits that walked on the moon made the suit on the right, called the PXS, or Planetary Exploration Suit. It's a prototype from ILC Dover. And the other suit is made by Oceaneering, and it's called the Z2. And it's kind of the same idea as the Russian Orlan suit, where you get in it from the back and just pop your head into this bubble in the front. So that Russian idea that's not the end of the line for that idea. That might be the way to do it. Maybe getting into the thing and being able to get in and out of it yourself without help, maybe that's the right thing. We're not sure, but there's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of things to try. There are even some people who want to make a kind of skin-tight suit. I would be afraid to try that. That would frighten me, to have a skin-tight spacesuit. That would be frightening. So, spacesuits, aside from how they work and where they came from, they show up every place. Pictures of spacesuits are just etched into the culture. 50 years ago, Snoopy was going to the moon as well. Snoopy was a big moon program mascot. People who did a great job in the Apollo program got what's called a silver Snoopy pin that they could wear around. It's a little picture of Snoopy riding around in a spacesuit. So that happened daily in your newspaper and on Sundays in color. But on the other end of the art spectrum, in the art world, people like Andy Warhol took spacesuit images and made them famous. Also, really serious well-known artists like Norman Rockwell and Robert Rauschenberg also used spacesuits. Here you have Gemini spacesuits painted by Norman Rockwell on the right. And on the left, there's a collage about the 60s featuring a spacesuit, but also featuring everything else that was going on in the 60s as a statement about what is happening in this decade. What are all the important things that we've seen? Even advertising. Smirnoff, just the thing to have when you're wearing a spacesuit, vodka. Probably not a good idea. Well, look at the other one. Who's going to clean the moon? Well, whoever cleans the moon, they should probably use less oil. So spacesuits should just show up every place, in advertising, art, pop culture, the whole thing. And since they show up in pop culture, here's the fun part of the day. Movie quiz. I don't have any prizes, but if you win the movie quiz and can answer all of these, you can walk out of here proud that your spacesuit movie knowledge is up to date. So all these involve spacesuits.
Quick question.
Yes?
About the caps that you see them wear on their head,
Uh-huh.
the white and black caps. Is there a reason for the white and black design, like white in the middle, black on the side?
Well,
That's a question. What's the style?
The question is the bump cap or the so-called Snoopy cap that's kind of white in the middle and dark on the sides. What's the reason for the color difference? If you get up close to it, you'll see that the white in the middle is very thin, perforated, flexible fabric. It's very light and stretchy, very sheer. On the sides, it's much more robust stuff, including deer skin, but it's much heavier on the sides because it has to accommodate a boom microphone and headphones and electronics and stuff like that. And that stuff is just a dark color to begin with, and there was no reason to change it. And so that's why you get the kind of white in the middle and dark on the sides. If you look at earlier ones, they had these really funny looking bump caps earlier that were like these big, they look like big pads, big long padding things that would go around your head. But they eventually went to a smaller, more form-fitting thing where that really sheer fabric just kind of held the headphones for you. So that accounts for the color difference. So movie quiz. We're going to go from the present back into the past, so it gets harder as you go. Which movie is this? The Martian. Yep, everybody's gotten that right. The Martian, just a few years ago. The premise is this guy gets lost in a storm, his colleagues leave without him, and he has to use his super awesome STEM knowledge and his training in courage and resiliency to find a way to live on Mars. I think most scientists just loved this movie because they just scienced the heck out of this before the story really does actually kind of work. So going back in time, what is this movie? Yes, it's Gravity from 2013. NASA people gripe about this movie a lot because, among other things, everything's going the wrong direction around the Earth, and all this impossible stuff happens. But it's an exciting story. And so there they are, two people having heavy, deep, and real conversation while they're also doing some work outside the spacecraft. Aside from having a chat, they're doing some work. Believe me, chat is totally secondary to the work. But, okay, so Gravity, 2013. Made a lot of people gripe. What's this one? This wasn't very popular in the theaters, but it's probably kind of popular streaming. What was the number of the last Apollo mission? What would have been the next one? Apollo 18. This was a 2011 horror film. And believe me, it was scary. The premise is that there was a secret Apollo 18 mission to the moon, and they went back because there was something very wrong there. And I won't try to spoil it too much, but there's someone else there already. So when you watch Apollo 18, you'll figure out what was waiting for these guys on the moon in the secret Apollo 18. This is probably everybody's favorite. What movie is that? I thought I heard it. 13, yes. Apollo 13 with our buddy Tom Hanks. Probably the best space movie soundtrack, for my money anyway. I listen to the soundtrack all the time. I think it's great. Very popular movie, pretty realistic. They got the suits and the interiors of the spacecraft pretty darn correct. They did a really good job with that. A lesser-known space movie. Remember this one? What was it called? Capricorn 1, with Elliot Gould, James Brolin, and none other than O.J. Simpson. Well, since we're talking about spacesuits today, look at those ridiculous suits. Look at the size of the neck rings on those suits. You could fit a pumpkin in there. The premise of that one was that they faked a mission to Mars, and the astronauts decided, we don't want to be part of this fakery anymore. We're going to blow the lid off this thing. And they try to escape and tell everybody that there was no mission to Mars. And I think at the end they show up at their own funeral. or something, and they tell everybody it was all fake. One of the least acclaimed space movies of all time, I think. Going back to the Cold War, do you remember this movie? This is about helping Russians stranded in orbit. Marooned, yes. This was Marooned from 1969 at the height of the Cold War. These guys, like I said, helped some Russians who were stranded in orbit. This was about being friends in space. Soon after this, you get the Apollo-Soyuz test project, you get détente, you get Nixon in China, you get Nixon to the Soviet Union. All of this is of a piece in the Cold War, and the movie makers wanted to tell a Cold War story in space. And that's... Oh, did I get that backward? Yeah, yeah. The Russian that you thought was gonna like, oh, that guy, he's just gonna leave him stranded. Oh, wait a minute, he's friendly, good. It was a really feel-good kind of story where they were gonna launch a rescue. There's like this crazy rescue rocket that they were gonna use. Yeah, it's worth a watch. It's dated, but I think it's worth a watch. This is easy. Yeah, everybody knows. 2001: A Space Odyssey. Probably one of the most influential space movies ever made, and actually one of the most influential films in terms of the post-war technological world, where it came from, what it means, what might be coming. It's a big philosophical statement, but it's got a lot of neat spacesuits in it too. So if you like space gear and equipment, that's a good one to watch. Anybody know what this one is? It's The Reluctant Astronaut, one of the least acclaimed space movies of all time, right next to one of the most acclaimed. Don Knotts played a guy who ran a kiddie ride at a fair, and his dad signed him up for the space program. And so he went to Houston to join the space program and found out that his job was going to be on the housekeeping crew. But he tried to keep up the fiction to tell everybody, oh, I'm an astronaut. But he ends up actually going into space. But P.S., he's deathly afraid of heights. So Don Knotts in space. It's probably worth a watch, too. The Reluctant Astronaut, 1967. Anybody recognize this one? One of the foundation space movies of all time. What was the destination this week 50 years ago? This was 1950's Destination Moon, based on a Robert Heinlein novel. This one actually got some stuff right. Look at all the insulation. Look at the helmets that you could move your head around inside of. Look at those kind of tomato worm kind of joints. This is 1950, and they're kind of anticipating some stuff correctly. And so it kind of works. So, outside of questions about how all this works, that's your breezy trip through spacesuits and pop culture today. So thank you for coming, and have a fun day.